Welcome back to House Education, Wednesday, February 11th, 2026. Continuing on with some more testimony from the Superintendent's Association and superintendents in the field. Now we're going to turn to just some testimony, I would guess we could call it reaction to what we have been discussing in this committee in terms of both maps. I would say we don't need to get hung up on individual lines, but sort of the overall philosophies behind it and some of the policy that's on the table, which is also ever evolving. Chelsea, you're up first, and probably since we started a new recording, we can have you introduce yourself again.
Dr. Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association, and I'm going to have the superintendents that are on the call. Some of them are at national conference this week, and some are still in their districts. If you want to introduce yourselves, Ryan, Len, and Patrick.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm Ryan Harity, Superintendent of Elmore, Morristown, and Stowe, Lamoille South Supervisory Union.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynn Coda. I'm the Superintendent for the Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union. That's Bakersfield, Berkshire, Montgomery, Richford, Sheldon, and Enosburg.
And good morning, everyone. Patrick Reen, trustee for VSA and superintendent for the Mount Abraham Unified School District. That is Bristol, New Haven, Starksboro, and Moncton.
Right. So thank you for inviting testimony on the district consolidation. We're going to call it a conversation starter, introduced last week by Chair Conlon. At the outset, the Vermont Superintendents Association appreciates that this proposal reflects key elements raised repeatedly in our prior testimony, most notably a more reasonable attention to scale and a clearer focus on creating school district structures that are operationally effective and efficient in the context of Vermont. For VSA, this proposal represents an important turning point in the consolidation conversation. Earlier proposals, beginning with the 5-district concept, were non-starters for our members. They failed to account for Vermont's geography, took scale too far, and would have effectively erased local governance while likely increasing rather than reducing costs for taxpayers. Those proposals did not align with how school districts actually function on the ground. This conversation starter strikes a more appropriate balance. It acknowledges the need for greater efficiency and effectiveness in governance and district operations, while not moving so far away from local identity that communities feel disconnected from their schools. Democratically elected school boards continue to play a meaningful role in decision-making and remain close to the schools and communities they serve. While we cannot speak today to the specific borders drawn in the proposal, we do recognize this as a far more earnest and grounded starting point. Even though we do not have a uniform solution to education reform that all superintendents would support, given the context each exists within, VSA has been clear that change is needed. We will not oppose progress in the name of the way we have always done things. At the same time, we believe it is important to reiterate that district consolidation is not an end in and of itself. Consolidation must be a means to broader reform, focused on achieving the right scale at every level, improving the quality and breadth of opportunities available to students, and ensuring that all students have access to high-quality education regardless of where they live. We also want to acknowledge the proposal's general approach to contracting and designation. While we cannot yet speak to the specifics, we agree with the underlying recognition that Vermont's historic academies and certain independent schools have long played an important role in serving regions without access to local public schools. That said, preserving inefficient governance and operational structures solely to maintain access to independent schools should not be the policy goal. In other words, we should be looking towards other solutions to maintain those goals. We urge the legislature to explore alternatives to the supervisory union structure that respect the role of historic academies within the broader education delivery system, while avoiding outdated structures that are not serving students or taxpayers well. Once again, I have to reiterate, the idea that school districts are the most efficient governance model is a very commonly held belief by VSA superintendents, but is not unanimous. And I would also like to emphasize that there are some cases that superintendents would not be able to share publicly how they feel on certain topics, which is why they have me. As this conversation moves forward, VSA believes it will be critical to support policy decisions with careful analysis and data In particular, we recommend further examination of the following questions. And once I'm done with this testimony, I really want to invite the superintendents on the call to talk about some of the logistics of what consolidation looks like, what data would be important to look at as well. But what new opportunities, programs, and efficiencies could realistically be achieved across larger districts by building on the strongest offerings that currently exist in individual systems? How will the transition be supported for districts, families, students, and communities? How will governance be determined? What would the proposed districts look like from a collective bargaining perspective? And what would it take to align contracts across new districts, both monetarily and logistically? Given concerns about lower spending districts experiencing tax increases under Act 73, what are the projected tax implications of the proposed districts when interacting with the new foundation formula and the home site exemption? What debts and assets would each system be contending with? Some of these you could pull data right now to look at those questions. Another essential next step is being candid about the timeline and the scope of work required to successfully consolidate districts. Meaningful consolidation does not happen on paper alone. It requires time for governance transitions, contract alignment, staffing decisions, financial system integration, community engagement, and trust building. Superintendents caution that setting unrealistic timelines risks undermining the very efficiencies and opportunities consolidation is meant to achieve. An honest, phased implementation plan will be necessary if this work is to be successful and sustainable. We also want to be very clear that school construction aid will be a prerequisite to the success of any meaningful reform. Without addressing the condition, capacity, and flexibility of school facilities, even the most thoughtful governance change will fall short. Our students deserve learning environments that support the educational opportunities policymakers are trying to create. I hear a lot about where that funding is going to come from. I will just make a plug for the fact that there's been significant buy downs year after year, which is important for taxpayers, but even setting aside some of that money year after year would have had a pretty significant pool of money, and it doesn't have to start big. I think people see a multi-billion-dollar price tag on school construction and get paralyzed and do nothing. And if we had started with doing something, even if it was small, and even if we leave hindsight behind, if we start doing smaller pieces now, even through like competitive grant programs and things like that, we really have to incentivize this change through construction aid. We can't continue to let our buildings crumble. Finally, we want to address a recurring critique of past consolidation efforts, particularly Act 46, that promised savings and expanded opportunities were not realized. We hear a different story. I specifically hear a different story from superintendents who have experienced successful mergers. They witnessed reinvestment of resources into student opportunities, increased flexibility in staffing and building use, and more resilient systems overall. While education spending has increased statewide, there is no credible way to causally attribute the increase to Act 46 mergers. No one can say what education spending would look like today had those mergers not occurred. What is clear is that Vermont's current governance structures are overly complex and increasingly misaligned with declining enrollment. Reforming those structures must be a part of a broader strategy to increase student opportunity, improve system sustainability, and provide long-term relief to taxpayers. The public deserves to see a clear through line between governance reform and operational changes to improved outcomes for students and property tax relief over time. This proposal is an important starting point, and VSA is committed to supporting the work of the General Assembly as this critical work progresses. And I want to turn to the superintendent, so I think can share stories about Act 46, what consolidation actually took, thinking about data and the processes that it will take if you do move forward with a proposal like this, and their own experiences. So, I want to start, Patrick?
Sure. Where to begin? I guess the first thought on my mind really is the recognition of the challenge of redistricting as we're talking about right now. And also the acknowledgement that it is a step in the direction we need to go if we're really serious about addressing affordability, equity, and quality. Perhaps the most important and consequential steps are the steps that will follow redistricting. I'm concerned if we don't get past the redistricting hurdle, those next more consequential, more beneficial steps will be harder to take if they can be taken. So I want to just sort of get that point in the room as we talk about the challenges and the realities of that kind of district consolidation. I know, Chelsea, I think, spoke really well to many of the things that I experienced as superintendent of the former Addison Northeast Supervisory Union that became the Mount Abraham Unified School District. The staffing flexibility, all those things Chelsea mentioned were very real for us. Costs continue to go up, so the idea that costs would go down, I think, was perhaps misleading at times for folks, but they didn't go up as sharply as they would have if not for Act 46 for us. I've given presentations before. We've reduced 43 positions over the last 8 years. We would not have been able to do that without the flexibility of being a school district, able to move staff across schools to meet needs of students while reducing staff to account for our declining enrollment. So we definitely bent the cost curve, even though costs continue to increase. Maybe I'll pause there for others to insert their thoughts.
I don't mind jumping in. I think back to Act 46, I serve as a supervisory union superintendent, and I had two at a side-by-side structure. So we had two merging boards, merging districts, and we also inherited another community from a neighboring supervisory union. So when I think back to, made a list this morning of all of the things that had to happen before we were ready to go live, and I'm happy to share the details if you'd like them, and I'm sure it's not comprehensive, but we were working emphatically for months and months and months just to operationalize at the scale that we had. So there was a lot of work that had to go into that. I'm concerned about the timeline in merging these larger entities, that there might not be enough runway to do this well. So I do hope that there are opportunities for us to give some really thoughtful feedback around what could be a more appropriate pace and timeline in order for us to be able to get everything in place, from curriculum to assessment plans to all of the business entity pieces to aligning policies to having the student information system, the financial system, and honestly, even the hiring of a superintendent. If any of these are sitting superintendents, they're going to be running their existing district or supervisory union while they're trying to stand up this new entity as well. And they aren't going to necessarily have a central office staff yet. So they're going to have to work through all of those hiring pieces as well. So I guess the timeline is definitely something. Are we sticking at this point on the Act 46 implications, or are you open to other thoughts?
Any thoughts you all have?
So I think before I switch off the Act 46 piece, I want to add to what Patrick said about saving money. One of the things, many of you on this committee know my Chief Financial Officer, Morgan Daybell, and he took a look back on what we were paying for a family plan in 2018 and what we're paying for a family plan now. And that cost for those family plans has gone up 235% since 2018. So in terms of the notion that we didn't save money on consolidation, I think we need to take a look at all of the elements that have occurred over these last many years that have played into the cost of education in Vermont. One thing that I am hoping is going to happen is that as we move forward around district consolidation and shifting to a foundation formula, I hope that there's a serious look at modeling the impact of the tax equalization on historically low spending districts and what that is going to do in terms of impact on taxpayers. I think that's a really important element to all of this.
And I would just like to add, Again, we thank this committee for your work for Vermont, and the conversations that you're having here are really critical to the future of our state. I've heard a lot of conversations about the need for modeling and really looking at leveling of contracts and what the cost implications will be of that. I think that the tax revolt of 2024 is one of the main reasons that we're having this conversation right now. And so we really want to think about, when we're making these decisions, and if consolidation is a path forward, what will be the financial implications of that? In our Elmore Morristown school district here, we have a relatively low tax rate. We're a low spending school district. And I know that our community is really concerned about the impact of consolidation on the local tax rate. And so for us to support that, we'd really want to see how that would play out and what the costs would be around that. And so there's two big questions that I would really encourage the committee to have around any discussions around consolidation. And it's really, first and foremost, will this improve the quality of education? And second is, will this actually save money or stabilize property taxes? And I think if you look at the maps through those lenses, it can really bring up a lot of questions and make sure that whatever steps are taken are going to be a positive outcome for a lot of work, for a lot of effort, a lot of disruption to our education system. Over the past 5 to 7 years in Vermont, we know that there has been many different changes to the financial, systems, to the proficiency-based grading system. There's so many different things that have been changed and adjusted, from special education to the classroom grading systems. And it's a lot of change for our students, for our teachers, for our communities. And so we just ask that any change that's being proposed really is thoughtful and measured. And we know that, based on the conversations you're having, that you agree with those points.
Thanks very much. A little bit of a follow-up. There's a lot of call from really everybody to say, show how consolidation will improve student outcomes. We can sit here and talk about how consolidation can lead to equity in funding. We can talk about how consolidation can give school boards tools to control costs better than they can today. But, I don't know how, or how would you suggest we could show that this will improve student achievement when it's really a bill designed to have more efficient governance, and with an eye toward providing more resources in the classroom? I don't know if we can make that final last mile leap and say, and those resources are guaranteed to provide higher student outcome.
You all talk a lot about regional high schools and middle schools. And one of the things that was most striking to me is some superintendents shared their programs of study across different high schools and middle schools. And the differences there are really striking. I think that was a really big wake-up call. Not that we need a wake-up call, but the disparate opportunities across school systems is something to really be paying attention to. And does that mean that consolidation automatically changes or reduces that? I don't know. But what we're doing right now, I will say there are very inequitable experiences across, when you look at programs of study specifically, and opportunities across school districts. Even if I draw attention to the chronic absenteeism conversation, right, there are some districts that are afforded $1 million when you talked about to be able to address chronic absenteeism. That is not ubiquitous, right? Social workers in every school is not ubiquitous. And so we're talking a lot about will consolidation increase opportunities? I think we also have to be really serious about the fact that we currently don't have equity across opportunities and experiences now too. But that's just my observation. I'm sure the superintendents have much more insightful things to share.
That's why I say, I think we can make the case for increased equity and opportunity. It's making the leap to saying that equity of opportunity also translates into better student outcomes. And that gets down to a level that we're not involved in.
One of the things
outcomes
that
versus opportunity is challenging.
One of the things that's coming to mind for me, and this is something we struggle with in my district, as we're engaged in conversations right now about potential school closure for 2 schools and sort of similar consolidation conversations on kind of the micro level that we're having at the state. It's difficult to imagine. We want to compare our potential future reality to our current reality. And that's an unfair comparison to be attempting to make. What we have to compare is future reality scenario A and future reality scenario B. Current reality isn't an option to maintain. So, as we continue to face declining enrollment here in MAUSD and we continue to face staffing reductions effectively every single year, what we're able to provide for our students gets squeezed more and more every year. And when we project out 10 years, if we continue on the trajectory we're on, what does that look like for students in terms of quality and outcomes versus what an alternative future might look like in terms of quality and outcomes? That's the comparison we need to be making, because current reality is not an option. And I guess to that point, well, I'll pause there. I'll save that point for a little bit later.
I think I have a couple of points I would like to add. One of the things when we're thinking about student outcomes, one of the things that districts like mine struggle with is hiring and retaining staff. So it is rare that I'm able to hire teachers who are traditionally licensed. It's more common for me to hire someone coming outside of education, learning how to be a teacher while they're teaching in my classroom. And we know that the quality of the teacher is the single greatest indicator of students' success. My teachers get trained up and then they're able to go a half an hour down the road and make more than $10,000 more per year. And so recruitment and retention is challenging. In a larger district under a foundation formula, we would have more of an ability to get closer in terms of the staffing piece. And there's another element in here as well. I've spoken to colleagues about their MTSS system, the system that we build within each of our schools to support our students. And I wonder if there's research to be done there to be able to look at, some of our poorer communities that have the higher poverty levels. If we were to compare the level of staffing that they're able to budget for to build a strong MTSS system compared to some of the more affluent schools who in theory have students that are starting from a more advantaged position to begin with, I think you might find in that data that there might be a discrepancy between the depth of services and supports that are being offered in both of those scenarios. I know that there's just in a one-on-one conversation with another colleague about the level of intervention, by way of example, in a like size system, in that superintendent system compared to one of the buildings that I run, and it was pretty dramatic, from 11 interventionists to 3. So trying to navigate that with students who are starting from a more disadvantaged starting position, I think it's pretty telling. So I think that from my perspective, if we're able to right size that a little, I think that we're going to get better educational outcomes for our students.
And I want to make an effort to answer your question, Chair Conlon, about educational outcomes. And so just providing some nuanced perspective. We have 2 high schools in Lamoille South. We have People's Academy and Stowe High School. Neither of the high schools could hold the other high school. Neither one has capacity to do that. In the proposed map, Lamoille High School is also included in our region. Lamoille doesn't have the capacity to hold any of the other high schools. And so I think what I would just advocate for is a more nuanced and surgical approach when thinking about the maps and thinking about the potential for improved educational outcomes. Because if the argument is really about a regional high school that would provide more access to additional coursework or additional AP courses, when we look at Stowe High and People's Academy, both of those high schools offer about 10 AP classes. And yes, if we had a much larger high school, maybe those students would have access to 20 or 30 AP courses, but they're not asking for that. Our families, our students are not asking for those additional courses, and our students are getting into excellent colleges and feeling like they have a really high quality education. And so what our communities would be asking is, what is the benefit on the other side of this consolidation? How will this improve educational outcomes for our local communities? And so they're really going to look at what their students have access to right now. And what we see is, when we have 90% of our students participating in extracurricular activities, that's something they really view as very valuable. And so if that would shift, or if that would change, if you increase transportation, or if those are all just things that our community is going to be asking. And so I support the conversation and the dialogue, but I think Vermont is small enough, and that's our strength, to really look at these situations from a nuanced perspective and think about whether or not it will actually benefit us in the end.
I think you bring up the point that we're going to wrestle with, is that any new foundation formula financing system ultimately is going to produce winners and losers. I can look at my own district. I think it's the highest spending unified union school district in the state. Clearly, under a new foundation formula, it is going to receive less dollars. And yes, corresponding lower taxes, which might be very attractive to a lot of people. So there's a hurdle there, to say, well, everything we're doing is great and we can't lose anything. That doesn't help the other end, that unless we just dump more money into the system, we have the other end that is saying, well, we need more and we're kind of counting on more in order to, equal up. We got to, it's just what we're wrestling with. And so I appreciate what you're saying. It's just the challenge of finding the balance of opportunity doesn't mean that everybody gets to maintain what they have without that costing us a lot more money. Representative Brady?
Where do any or all of you see cooperative services fitting into the kind of future landscape here? Obviously, there was a strong recommendation from the redistricting task force around that as a kind of needed layer in our system to more quickly pool some resources, regardless of district changes, and probably even with some district changes. So I'd be curious where you see the opportunities, where you put that on a timeline, what concerns you have.
I'm happy to answer that question. I think there's a lot of opportunity for cooperative services agreements across different regions. One of the main challenges that we have is really around special education and providing specialized services for our students in smaller schools. Sometimes we do not have the capacity to have very specialized programs for students that might need a different delivery system. And by regionalizing some of those services, I think we can improve the quality of that and reduce the cost of sending students far away. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that a student might have a need for a very specialized program that we can't offer. And those students are oftentimes on wait lists for 2, 3, 4 years. We've had students that have been on those wait lists, and so their quality of programming is really at a disadvantage. And so I think that by regionalizing those programs, we can really improve quality of education for some of our most vulnerable students. And also, I think it would be very cost effective. So I support that. I think there's a lot of opportunity for negotiating things like transportation across those regions as well. And so I think it's a conversation we should be having more.
I would echo everything Ryan just said, and I sort of see that as a tool to move us in the direction that we're looking to go in terms of affordability, equity, and quality, not unlike redistricting as a potential tool to move us in that direction. A concern I have, and sort of a request, I guess, of the legislature would be, when we get to critical decision points about providing tools to make the change that's necessary, important to see those decisions through. Because the concern is we don't take the action to provide the tools that are necessary to make the change, while we do take action to continue to create the pressures where the only option you have is to make the change that you now don't have the tools to make. I have a fear that that could happen, right? We don't act to create these regional cooperative agencies. We don't act to create new districts, but we do act to implement spending caps, or we do act to implement a foundation formula that only exacerbates the challenges that I'm personally facing right now in our area to make the change that's necessary. So just try to avoid that scenario. That would only make it harder.
I just really quickly, like all legislation, right? The proof is in the implementation, and the magic is in the supported implementation. You've had enabling legislation around BOCES for a couple of years now. And what I think about is there would certainly, I think, need to be tweaks to how that currently is structured. You bringing together a cooperative service agency is not a small feat. And when you think about the current legislation where you are bringing together multiple boards, so if you were to think of a region right now, and let's say we're going with the 5 CISA model, you could be bringing together 30 boards, right, to be establishing those CISAs, and that is going to take a lot of time. And so just thinking about the logistics of the enabling legislation around BOCES, I think is an important step. If you are going to consider that direction, is how are we making this as easy is a hard word to say, but easy as possible for successful implementation. Because if it was easy to implement, the enabling legislation would have seen more of those structures arise after you had passed that law. But I do still think that there is promise in the shared services. I just want to implore you to think about implementation and how tricky that is. And if we're talking about bending cost curves and things like that, that's another one that is going to take time. And so we shouldn't be misleading to the public about that. And I do want to, for the record, say, I'm sorry for my facial expressions. There's a lot of activity going on outside that window. It's falling down.
Representative Harple.
Well, in the explanation that you just gave, and thank you, because that is important to consider. You said, though, if we go with 5, like, why? I mean, does it not really save money until we get that big with 5? Like,
But 5 was just brought up because that was in the
I know.
report.
In the
Well,
redistricting.
right, I know, but I'm saying that, like, so that would be tricky, but would it be maybe less tricky if we were going with more and bigger, or no, it'd be more and smaller CISAs?
So we really haven't even developed that language for us. And, so the question could be, we keep it the way it is. It's voluntary. It doesn't say how big they have to be, but there's also nobody out there being its champion and organizer. It's ultimately a people management effort.
You need to think about the talent pool as well, right? Like the beauty of CISAs is that you get very highly specialized professionals that will likely be pulled from school districts to form. And in areas where we already have staffing shortages, like Lynn spoke to, It's just something to consider. The more that you have of that, you have to think about that talent pool and the number of specialized positions that you have available in that particular region.
I think
I guess
it's
my
also-
Lynn, go ahead.
It's also, I apologize, it's hard to be virtual. I can't really see all of you. I think it's also challenging when we're thinking about reducing the number of districts in order to be operationally more efficient. I think that there's a fine line with the CISAs. I think that there's a good opportunity to gain some efficiencies, especially around the specialized areas. But I think we have to be careful also not to create so many that we lose that efficiency by having to pay for the creation of maybe not the right number of CISAs.
Do you have a follow-up?
Oh, it's not really a question, I guess just a follow-up thought. I think that's a really interesting point. So we heard that, you know, if we were to implement CISAs to achieve more efficiencies, like, you know, pulling staff, we don't want duplicative services at both levels, right? So it's sort of an interesting tension between pulling, you know, existing expertise from districts, but I mean, theoretically, I think we want to sort of expand the reach of our most expert education leaders. So in a way, that's part of the design, I think. And so, but it does create this sort of interesting implementation challenge where but I think we did hear really clearly, like, the thing you don't want the expertise to live in the school district and necessarily at the CISA. Like, we have to make sure that we're not, you know, that we're putting the right expertise at the right level.
Supplementing, not supplanting.
Exactly. There you go. Thank you.
Co-opt a special education term.
Yes.
I was
Yeah.
thinking about it as pooling instead of pulling, right?
Yeah.
Pooling
Yes.
expertise versus pulling expertise.
I'll let you go first.
Yeah.
Representative Brady?
So speaking of, Patrick, could you see CISAs and new districts simultaneously? Or is it like, I guess, where do you see the kind of order of operations here? Hearing what Chelsea says about CISAs in our current system, you've got more boards to deal with to do that pooling.
Good
I
question.
don't know if that's,
Simultaneously makes me a little nervous because that's
Yeah.
Yeah, I
happening at the
understand.
same time, and just capacity to make that all happen.
Yep.
And I could see pros and cons to either one happening before the other or after the other. There's something appealing about having moved to fewer districts before creating CISAs because you have fewer entities, to Lynn's point, to collaborate to create this and to ensure that we are pooling and not pulling. Depending on that timeline, you know, the opportunities that could be created by these CISAs that maybe could get created sooner than the timeline to redistrict. I don't know that we'd want to necessarily, you know, not consider that as an opportunity to pursue, but I guess I would slightly lean in sort of off the top of my head reaction to new districts than CISAs as maybe the better way to go.
Do you think sorry.
Go ahead.
My sense has been that despite the BOCES enabling legislation a couple of years ago, and then sometimes we hear like, well, you can do it now, but that's not happening around the state. The reality is, because we are basically asking this giant question every day at the state level of like, what's our future state going to be? Are we going to redistrict everything? That has pretty much shut down the conversation or the interest around the state, or that has stifled like us creating that enabling legislation. And the fact that we don't now have, you know, 7 CISAs operating today is largely a consequence of the conversation and the policy decisions in the interim. Is that that's my working belief? Is that a fair
Right. I
working?
mean, so the challenge, right? I could, you know, spearhead creating a CISA with colleagues in Chittenden County.
Yep.
And then 3 years from now, redistricting took place, and I'm in Addison County as a single district now, and all the effort we just put in to create this CISA now just gets undone because of the rearrangement of the districts. And now we've got to create a new CISA with different teams. So I think that's where some of the concern is with the uncertainty about what the future holds.
But I just have to ask your thoughts on there is a CISA or BOCES right now taking place over 2 full counties. And clearly, no matter what our redistricting turns out to be, I doubt we're going to have, since we've already rejected the 5 district model, I think there'll be multiple districts within that. And I guess I'm, it's happening right now, I guess. And I think that one started prior to this recent push.
7 years ago, they started talking about this.
Exactly.
When I first
But I
got
don't
here.
want it to be a barrier
Yeah.
to having this conversation because it's ongoing through the district redistricting. They were only just now, in November or whatever, made us BOCES, approved of BOCES, or January, approved. So.
State approved, yeah.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand if you think the current policy landscape here is a barrier to on the ground collaboration and BOCES formation right now.
The dynamic that's happening here, yes.
Well, and it certainly not limited to forming BOCES.
Well, to a lot of things.
Construction
Yes, you're right.
decisions, even
Yeah.
educational.
Yeah.
Being able to hire.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The conversations you all have here are very monumental to what's happening in school districts right now.
I just want to circle back to something that Lynn Coda said, just about it's important to know the tax implications of what we do with the foundation formula. That's going to be a bit of a hard one in that it really is going to depend on the, individual person. Because as we go to a new homestead exemption model rather than a homestead rebate model, everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. And that it's almost, we can only sort of say that in general, most Vermonters will come out better than going into it if the second home tax yields what it says it's going to yield and all of that. So I just put that out there as, as challenging as it is to say we can guarantee it's going to improve student outcome. I don't know. I think I can pretty solidly guarantee it's going to at least stop the decline in student opportunity and hopefully improve opportunity for students. Taxes are going to be more individual.
Mr. Conlon, you were a school board member. That's exactly what happens now, right? Like it's
Right.
different. Like they say, if you own a home of $300,000 and your income is this, then this is what your tax that tax looks like. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I hope that the nuance doesn't get in the way of trying to model the implications because there are a lot of worried people out there.
I think it's fair to say that if your district starts receiving more money than it is currently spending, pressure on taxes will be upward. And if your foundation formula creates less money than you're receiving now, taxes will be going downward pressure. But again, it depends on each individual circumstance. Go ahead, Lynn.
I just wanted to reiterate what Chelsea said. I know it will be challenging, and I know that we have some really incredibly bright people in the state that can come up with a variety of ways to model that out. I know that that part is very scary for some of the communities that are really low spending now. And while we're talking about this, I just want to say I don't envy the position you're all in. And at the same time, I want to thank you for taking that first step to get us moving into a direction to consider, a map to get us started. It's not lost on me that the conversations that you're having are hard now, and down the road, we're going to be faced with hard conversations too around scale at all levels. And I don't think this is unlike conversations that have happened in Vermont for generations. If you go back to the early 1900s and then again in the 1960s, there were people that didn't want their children to go to school with I'll use one of my towns by way of example. There was a West Hill school and there was a North Hill school, and I think there were 15 others in this one small town, and they didn't want their kids to go to the same schools, but they merged into the larger schools, and people, got over it eventually, and they had better opportunities. So I know we have some tough roads ahead through district and other scaling up at all levels that we've got to work through. But I just hope we continue with the forward momentum, and I hope that we continue to try to help people to see the outcomes both on taxation and on opportunity for students.
That may be the perfect comment to end this on, unless there's any other questions.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering, this is a question for Lynn, as we talk about moving forward with school districts only and not supervisory unions, would you comment on that from your perspective?
I think that it makes sense to have school districts only. I think that there's a lot of things that we have to duplicate. I have a supervisory union right now. I have 3 boards, and I have colleagues that have far more than 3 boards. So we run multiple payrolls. We run multiple audits. We just duplicate so many things. I think that operationally it's much more efficient. I think the greatest part about moving from a supervisory union to a supervisory district is it reduces the barriers of flexibility. So being able to make both financial, like resource decisions and human resource decisions without the barrier of running multiple districts could allow us to become much more efficient. And I think it could help us to create better opportunities for students, because right now I can look at scale and I can look across those existing districts, but I can't look across the supervisory union, which makes it challenging. So I think it makes sense. I think that the language that you put in around the designation contract makes sense, because I do think that there's a role for those historic academies. And I think that some of the language or some of the reasons that people have shared around protecting supervisory unions has been around choice. And I think that there are parts of the state where the historic academies are really important, and the idea of the designation contract still allows that to happen, especially in the areas that don't have access to public high schools. So I believe that moving to districts makes a lot more sense.
Thank you, Lynn. Ryan, would you also comment?
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. I think there's pros and cons to both. And I think that it's important to have that conversation honestly. We have a supervisory union. We have been a unified union. We were a supervisory union, then a unified union, now back to a supervisory union. And so I've lived both the unified district and the supervisory union model. I can tell you from an efficiency standpoint and from a superintendent standpoint, it's easier and more manageable to navigate a school district. I think financially, it is absolutely, as Lynn mentioned, easier to be more fungible with your resources and make sure that as needs arise, you can allocate resources where they're needed. And so I think there's a big benefit to that. Managing multiple districts simultaneously creates a lot of redundancies in accounting in our business operations, and that's a fact. There's also some costs associated with borrowing money and carrying money over short term when you're operating multiple districts, where you have to, take on debt temporarily where you wouldn't have to do that in a district, and that's a cost to our taxpayers. At the same time, though, in a supervisory union, we also need to acknowledge that there is more local voice, and the school boards are able to have a lot more say into their individual schools and feel more connected to those decisions as they're being made. And so, there is a value around that we need to discuss openly and think about, if we move away from that, what are we losing and what does that mean? And one of the reasons that Stowe, I think the primary reason that Stowe voted to withdraw from the joint district was around school construction and getting a bond passed. And so what they had said at the time was that they didn't think they could get a bond passed if they were in a larger district, and the students in the other towns wouldn't have access to the school that they were bonding for. It ended up that the bond didn't pass based on a lot of different factors, but it's just, those are things that need to be considered when you're having that discussion.
Thank you. So Linda, unless it's quick, I'm going to need to call it here because our time is running past.
Could I just give you two quick pieces?
Yes.
It's super quick. Supervisory unions are not allowed to borrow money and they're not allowed to own property. So those are two other reasons why they are less efficient. So we are leasing spaces where if we were a district, we could own those spaces.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all very much, as usual, for your very insightful words and commentary. We're going to jump right into our next this is a little bit of presentation, a little bit of Q&A, and frankly, a little bit of follow-up on some of the comments we just heard. Come join us, Julia, if you would. So I have asked JFO to join us today to sort of talk about the work on the foundation formula, the sort of work to date, but work that's still being done, and really open it up to everybody. If you have questions, we can talk about like what has been modeled, what is yet to be modeled, what needs to be decided before any more modeling can actually take place. With that, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. As the chair mentioned, he asked me to come in and do a brief review of the foundation formula. I'm not planning on walking through a slide deck unless that's helpful. An update in terms of the work that's ongoing about the foundation formula and financing from the JFO perspective. And then also to talk about any of the questions that you all have or questions about modeling. So, Chair Conlon, would you like me to dive into the foundation formula and review or talk about modeling? Where would you like me to begin?
I don't know if I have a strong opinion here.
Okay, I'll jump into it. If I'm going too weedy, let me know. I live in the weeds, and if I'm not going weedy enough, always happy to go deeper. So Act 73, as you'll recall, it contingently created the foundation formula and many other financing aspects. A lot of that work, of course, was done outside of this committee. And so as a reminder, before we talk about the ongoing work, a reminder of really what Act 73 included. So it contingently created this foundation formula that we're talking about. That's funding that's based on a statutory base amount that's increased by inflation. And then that base amount is applied to a school district's weighted student count. So there are those weights for students from certain circumstances that the evidence shows cost more to provide education. And that funding of the base amount times the weighted pupil count gives us the education opportunity payment, the EOP. The other piece of that too are grants. There's a small school grant. I know you're all familiar with this. You heard testimony earlier, a small school grant and a sparse school grant. So assuming that a school district fits or a school fits into the criteria established as a two-part test for the small school grant and or the sparse school grant, there's additional funds included in the education opportunity payment for that school district.
Yeah.
Clarifying question. So it's not part of the weighted.
Correct.
The way it is in our current system.
Correct. Yeah. So under current law, we have tax capacity weights, and there is a weight for school districts that are considered sparse. So every student that is within a sparse district gets a sparse weight. And then there's also small school weights. The policy decision was made last year, instead of including that in the weighted pupil count, to instead create a grant for students enrolled in those schools. will visit a school district based off of the students enrolled in schools.
Is it fair to think of those grants as off the top of the ed fund in terms of that phrase we use?
I really appreciate that question because the foundation formula really changes that.
Okay.
The whole intuition of off the top of the education fund is gone. And that's because under current law, the way that the financing structure works is there are these state categorical aid programs like special education, universal meals, that are equally impacting all districts' property tax rates, regardless of how many, those are not the like local decisions. And then there's the school district budgets that, assuming they're approved by voters, we then subtract all of the offsetting revenues and get the education spending, it's a technical term. And that's used in the determination of a local homestead tax rate. So that's where we sort of see the difference in like off the top of the education fund versus education spending. In the foundation formula, there is an established equation where it's here's our base amount increased by inflation. Here's the school district's weighted pupil count. Here is the money associated with those small and sparse grants. And that is what's flowing to the school district. And all school districts will have the same equalized homestead property tax rate, non-homestead property tax rate, and non-homestead residential property tax rate. So it's a real significant financing shift.
So redone. So the small school grants and the sparse school grants, so it would be possible to be both, right?
Mhm.
And so under our current construct, and if we shift to the foundation formula, but the money is still flowing to the school district, right? Like it's under the foundation formula, or am I?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's, I think this is your question. Tell me if I'm not answering it. It's determined at the school level.
Yeah. Okay.
If that school qualifies as small and or sparse, it could be both.
Yep.
Then it qualifies for the grant, but the grant flows to the school district along with the education.
That's precisely my question. Thank you.
So it creates this foundation formula, which includes the base, the weights, and these small and sparse grants. It also creates something called supplemental district spending. So another part of the financing mechanisms that were established in Act 73. And essentially what that does is it permits school districts to spend above spend up to a capped amount above their education opportunity payment, we'll talk about that in a second. And it needs to be approved by voters. And that cap, that supplemental district spending, is determined by the number of students in the district. So the more students that exist in a district, the more a school district can put to voters to spend in supplemental district spending. That supplemental district spending is paid for by something called the supplemental district spending tax. And we can get really weedy, but I'm going to stay high level for now. Essentially, the way that the supplemental district spending tax works is it equalizes the tax rates across all school districts based off of the school district with the lowest grand list value per pupil. So what does that actually mean? It means that the more significant difference there is in property value per kid of school districts, the more funds are going to be recaptured from the school districts with the higher property value. So if everybody had the exact same property value per student, there would be no money recaptured at the state level. But the more significant the variance, the more money that's going to be recaptured at the state level of those higher grand list value districts.
Can I ask a clarifying question? The cap, the supplemental spending cap is based on the number of students without weights, correct?
Mhm. So that's the supplemental district spending in a nutshell. And then the other financing change, there are a lot of financing changes. I'm trying to hit like the
big picture ones are the property classification changes, right? So breaking out that non-homestead property classification under our current financing system. We have homestead, which is where you live and the surrounding land, and non-homestead, which is literally everything else. That includes second homes, deer camp, parking lots, businesses, you name it. Act 73 splits that and says essentially those non-homestead properties that someone could be living in full-time, but is not, that's subject to a different tax rate. And Act 73 also created the homestead exemption. And I came in at the tail end of your conversation and you're talking about income sensitivity. This is replacing the current law income sensitivity. And essentially what it's doing is based off of a household's income. They can exempt a certain portion of their homestead property from property tax. So essentially, if the household has lower income, and they would then qualify for saying, okay, we're going to take off the first X% of our property value. So we're only going to be taxed on a portion of our homestead property rather than the entirety. And that creates a system where when property taxpayers go to vote on supplemental district spending, they will know exactly the tax rate they are voting on. And we will be able to better explain how a person's overall property tax is calculated, where there no longer will be two rates on two different bases like we have under the current law.
Brady.
Is that exemption based solely on income but not wealth?
I guess I'll provide a very nonpartisan staff answer. It depends on how you define wealth. That's a challenging term to define. It's based off of household income. So that's essentially the sum of all of the income under one roof. It's not factoring in some of the components that you all often talk about when talking about wealth. I will say that because it's based off of a household's property value, it is capturing the property wealth as well as the income, but other assets, for instance, stuff that you have sitting in your Roth are not going to be included in that calculation. Okay, so that was sort of like the whirlwind big picture financing changes that I thought would be helpful to provide a brief overview of. All of those pieces, among others that I didn't speak to, are subject to contingencies. So they're only going to come into effect if these contingencies are met that I know you've all been talking about. The contingency that's been talked about more broadly are the new school districts being operational, right? There's another piece of it that is the General Assembly has received this report that JFO was required to contract for in Act 73. Shall I keep going? Is this the right level? Okay. So that we've got the new school district boundaries as one contingency, and then we've got this report as the other contingency. And so JFO was charged in Act 73 of going under contract with a consultant or consultants to examine a whole host of outstanding questions or pieces that the General Assembly felt needed further diving into. And those charges were included for us within Act 73. So JFO recently executed a contract. The entire contract was awarded to American Institutes for Research, AIR. And that report is due to come back to all of you in December of this year. We had an extensive review process for that, which included the RFP questions. Then we sent out identical list of follow-up questions to the bidders. We had a panel interview. We did reference checks. It's a lot of work, and we have landed on AIR. And that scope of work really is reflective of what Act 73 charged. So that includes revisiting the special education weights to move from disability category to services. Actually, I have the scope of work open, so I don't want to forget anything. Recommending any updates to the foundation formula determined to be empirically necessary for an adequate and equitable education, and taking into account cost savings generated by new, larger consolidated districts. Task 3 is for the contractor to recommend suitable geographic measures for determining sparsity within the foundation formula. So getting deeper into that sparsity grant. How should we consider sparsity? Task 4 is to determine whether it costs more to educate a secondary student than an elementary student in Vermont. And if so, for the contractor to recommend a weight to capture that cost differential. Task 5 is to recommend how to account for the provision of career and tech ed, CTE, in the funding formula. So both how to account for it, should it be a categorical grant, should it be a weight, and also how much. And then to recommend any other updates or changes that are a ripple effect from any of their findings and tasks in the earlier tasks that I just laid out. In addition to that, our contractor is required to train both JFO staff as well as AOE staff in all of the analyses the consultant updates. The consultant identifies needs to be updated in the future. So essentially the consultant is going to say, every X number of years, we would recommend that the weights and base are recalibrated. Here's how you do that. Here's the methodology. And then JFO and AOE will be trained for the consensus process to do that. And then finally, they'll be providing legislative testimony after their findings. So that's really big picture where we are at within the process.
Representative Brady?
Would any regional differences or impacts beyond, I see it sounds like one specific to sparsity, but say cost of living or cost of competing, leveling up of contracts, would that fall under that number 6 other ripple effects, or would that need to be spelled out explicitly if the legislature wants more information on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it will depend on what the contractor finds. I don't want to speak for them and their work, especially because they're really early on. I think they will, or not I think, they will be identifying places, and this is also included in the contract, where they recommend there's additional analysis or points that they would raise for us to consider. We have a weekly standing meeting with the contractor. We're in the process of setting up a meeting with the Agency of Education. So it really is an iterative process in terms of understanding where the contractor is at and the work that they're doing. And it's also a third-party contract. So we can't tell the contractor, here's where we think you should land. They're going to land somewhere, and that's for them to stand behind. Okay. Let me just see if I had anything. That's what I had planned in terms of the quick JFO review to help reground the conversation or remind you all in terms of what we're doing. I'm happy to talk about modeling or switch to questions, whatever.
I think that would be great to talk about modeling a little bit. We have calls for it. We also know that you can't model something that you don't have.
Yes. So I did make a few notes, and I will admit I have not watched all of your conversations and testimony. I'm trying to keep up, but we're all busy. So I think there's a couple of pieces that are helpful to think about with respect to modeling and analysis. Big picture, one of those is there is a significant amount of work and modeling that we have already done and that we have presented throughout last legislative session, worked on over the summer, and continue to work on now. I also want to know where the fiscal is the sister office to legislative council. As you know, you may work on language that never sees the light of day with legislative council. The same is true for our office. So, just because I'm not talking about something in testimony does not mean that it's not being worked on. I guess that's one thing that I would say. Another thing I would say is that outstanding policy decisions really matter. And one of the questions is, one of the things I've been hearing is we need modeling for maps. And my response is, well, what maps do you want me to model, right? I think the district builder tool is really helpful to understand some of those preliminary questions. And when we get into how things will shake out from maps, first, we would need to know what maps are being considered. And then what are the questions associated with those maps that we want, that you all need answers to. And in some of those cases, we don't know. And those are questions for the field. How would a foundation formula impact their school district budgets? I can talk about at the aggregate level, what it would look like in the state, how the mechanics would work. But in terms of local funding decisions, that's going to depend on the school boards. There's the other sort of outstanding policy decisions there are a number of other pieces within Vermont's education financing structure that still haven't been sorted out within Act 73. So some of those questions of categorical aid, right? Transportation, special education, pre-K, like looking at that intent list just within Act 73, all of the policy decisions that are made related to each of those outstanding decision points, of course, will impact the fiscal picture. And I know you all know that, but I think it's helpful to remind that. And then lastly, the findings of the contracted study that I just spoke about. So part of that contracted study is for the contractor to take into account to estimate and then take into account cost savings of new consolidated districts. One of the conversations that we're having and that we're thinking about is to the point of it won't be me estimating it, but the contractor can't estimate cost savings of new districts if they don't know what those new districts are going to be, because those lines really do matter, as I know you all know more intimately than I do. So to that end, those are the kinds of conversations that we are continuing to monitor and meet with our contractor to talk about in terms of the work they can or cannot be doing in terms of that task. And lastly, going a little bit more deeply into one of the questions that I came in on the tail end of is in terms of the intuition of the overall impacts of the foundation formula. I just want to reiterate what Chair Conlon said. The intuition of those impacts really does hold true, that if you have a foundation formula that's bringing everybody based off on their weighted student count to the same level of funding per weighted student, the school districts that have higher spending per weighted pupil now are going to be receiving less under the foundation formula, and the districts that have lower spending per weighted pupil are going to be receiving more. Those districts that are receiving less before supplemental district spending will also see a lower property tax rate because we're pulling that rate down. Those districts that are have a lower per pupil spending and are going to see an increase in funding are going to see a higher property tax rate. And that modeling in those spreadsheets I presented last year in the Senate. So those are my list of sort of prepared comments.
Go ahead. I have several.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Go ahead.
So this might be very overly simplistic. Well, I guess there's two parts to it. So when we talk about, obviously we would need to know the district size in order and the boundaries in order to understand the costs savings or the efficiency that it could. Is that efficiency going to be baked into the base foundation formula?
It will be included in the report that we will come back to you, or the contractor will come back with in December. The contingency is just for you all to receive the report. So you'll receive that report, which will include those estimated savings and then a recalculated base and weights corresponding with those estimated savings. It'll then be a policy decision. Do you want to amend Act 73 to change those numbers?
So just one quick follow-up. So if we assume, if we go under the assumption that a larger district is going to have more cost efficiencies and savings, then we absolutely will need to know how big these districts are going to be and how many districts are going to be in play in order to get to a foundation formula.
I mean, I guess I would say the more precise information that we have and the contractor has, the more precise answer and findings they can make. If there aren't district maps, of course, these are all policy choices that I know you all know. We will then need to work with our contractor to help them figure out how can they best respond to that task within the scope of work if there isn't a map for them to be analyzing.
Representative Brady and Representative Brown.
So is it possible then to model the PC map versus like, FY25? Is that something we can get a rough,
I guess,
or is a real map on the table?
what does model mean? Like, when I hear we need modeling, like, what is needed?
I guess what would be the district's allocation, their foundation formula, their EOP under this map, given because then that would allow us to compare to, what it's like in current conditions and see where there's
Yes, that is feasible, with the huge caveat that we still don't have the small or sparse by necessity hammered out. And because of the outstanding policy choices related to categorical aid, it would come with like a highlighted bold caveat that says this is not capturing the entirety of the estimated funding going to that district. So it may seem that a district will be receiving less or more. But until we know all of the pieces of the foundation formula, we won't be able to say that with certainty. And if that is what is meant by modeling, absolutely. And I don't know does the district builder have long-term weighted ADM by the school district?
I don't think district builder does.
Ooh.
No, it's just ADM.
Okay, so all to say, if it had long-term weighted ADM, which I guess it doesn't, it would be a very simple calculation. That is, the foundation formula at its core is quite simple. You take the long-term weighted ADM and you multiply it by the base amount. And then you add the small and sparse grants. So that's why I'm asking, but yes, we can follow up with that.
And then I guess if folks want to say, am I going to be better off or worse off, then you look at what within those drawn lines, what the current spending is current today.
Yeah. Yes, you could do that. And my my hesitancy is that because there are outstanding decisions, the education, our office has produced these comparison tables and we can do them. They need to be approached with caution because the education spending and the education opportunity payment are not apples to apples. They may be, but the decisions haven't been made yet to determine if they are apples to apples. So we can look at them and that will provide insight with caution.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. So you said that part of the charge of the contracted study was, once we have new district lines, was to sort of estimate the cost savings of those new consolidated districts. And can you say a little bit more about sort of what that analysis looks like? Like what data do they need to pull from the field to do that? Because I think, just in my own mind, I'm thinking, when consolidated districts and then will cause operational changes in the field. And until we know what that looks like, I'm just confused about how they would model that. And maybe there's some sort of standard assumptions that they work with. Can you shed any light on that process?
I will say I'm not able to shed as much light as probably you're hoping for because it will depend ultimately on the contractor's work. That was a direct, the language that we include in the scope of work is verbatim what was included in Act 73. So Act 73 required the contractor to look at cost savings from new consolidated districts. And so they will be, the way that the analysis works is it's cost function analysis and resource analysis, and working with Vermont data, meeting with certain professionals in Vermont to better understand it. When they've done that work, I'm happy to have them come in and talk about it in more detail. Part of the included in the contract and the scope of work requires the contractor to include a detailed list of all of their underlying assumptions of the analysis, the data used, and their methodology so that it can be replicated. So once the work's been done, we'll be able to say exactly here were the assumptions.
So it's not as if they have to wait for the change to, actually happen before they can analyze it. They're going to sort of proceed based on past experience and what that sort of organizational efficiency has looked like elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And they've done a number of these financing studies in a number of other states. So they're well versed in this kind of work.
Sorry. Just quickly, I think I got most of it out of what I just heard, but in a nutshell, we're being asked many times as legislators that where's the modeling? And everybody is making an assumption that once we have a map that we've come to some agreement on, let's just say we've come up with a map that we've come to an agreement on, that then we could do the modeling based on that map. But decisions that need to, I'm really, there's a number of other decisions that need to be made. And that report needs to come back in December before we can even model whether the districts that we've already agreed on are actually going to produce what we are hoping to get out of it, which is, multiple factors. Is that essentially it?
I would say there are a lot of outstanding questions that we would need to understand the answers to provide some of the analysis. And I will admit, this is coming from my background in economics. I hear the request for modeling. I don't know what modeling always means. And I think that people within the building and within Vermont, just in general, use the term modeling to refer to very, very different things. And so I think from my perspective, the more that we can understand what exactly are the answers that people are trying to get at, the more we can help you get at the answers to those questions.
This committee is definitely emphasizing being more specific.
And if I could just say, it's not only the data points that you're asking that we need to identify before modeling can take place, because how can you do modeling without knowing all that information? But it's also, I'm asking more about the timeline of the ability. I just want to make sure everyone understands the timeline of what we're getting into in this Act 73 process. And I'm not sure that we all here and in Vermont understand about that time. You know, and it's not specifically about the data points in the modeling, it's how they all unfold in what order. You know, and so you helped a lot with that today, I think. And it's been a little bit of an eye opener for me. So thank you.
Yes.
Am I correct in that the foundation formula as it exists right now in Act 73 obviously is based on lots of, you know, assumptions about our system? Labor is the biggest one. That it's using a statewide average for teacher salaries in terms of that cost piece of the foundation formula. I mean, I can tell you where my thinking and concern goes with that, but I guess I can just ask the question.
I would say I would need to go back and review the specific inputs. I don't want to say which specific input was or wasn't used. I can definitely follow up. I'll send the memo to Matt that outlines the modeling. That work, I want to clarify, and I know this is not what you're asking, was not a simple average of how much it costs to educate in Vermont. The work is a regression cost function modeling, which essentially it's in econometric tool, looking at the existence of significant or not significant relationships across the state in comparison to a number of different factors while controlling for others. So it's not taking an average and saying, you know, on average, Vermont is spending X number per pupil, this is what our base is going to be. And the work that's being done by the contract uses the same methodology, where it will be looking at, I was just actually looking at their data requests. We're meeting with the agency within the next few days to walk through their data requests. And it includes at the school and district level, the FTE counts in different positions from 2017 to 2025, and the salaries associated with them and the benefits and all of these district and school level data points. Did that answer your question where you were going with it?
Sort of. I think, you know, because we work so much on the policy side and then things move pretty quickly on the money side. And obviously there's been much discussion of small, sparse. There's another end of the spectrum where there are some pretty stark cost of living differences that will directly impact the cost of labor in parts of the state that also tend to be more at scale and have, you know, class sizes at right around or above the minimums that we're putting in. And so I don't understand all of the sort of number crunching that will go on, but it leaves me concerned that the only thing that those districts will be able to do is to cut, that it will, you know, force them into a place where significant cutting is the reality because of what salaries are, what the cost of living is, and what efficiencies already exist, and cannot be squeezed out of the system. And so the only thing left is cutting.
No comment. That this gets back to exactly the piece of outstanding policy choices.
Thank you. You came on short notice and that this was really helpful. And these little refreshers we may just continue with as we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the modeling that exists is where, like, what's the best place or the, the analysis, the things you did at the end of last session? Is it on the JFO page? Is there a particular place that's best to go find that stuff?
Yeah, we did put together at the end of last session, a website on JFO that had like broad strokes of each 454 modeling at the end of last session. And then it ripples out through all of the committees. We haven't aggregated all of it in one place. But we're staff, let us know if there's something specific you're looking for, or let Matt know and I can coordinate with Matt and we can always come back and talk through any of this if that's helpful.
The follow-up about the modeling and the formula as it passed last year's would be great.
Yeah, I've got a modeling memo with an arrow next to it, which I'll follow up with.
Potentially, we might even get a 101 explanation of that.
All right. Thank you very much. Committees, everybody okay if we just press on?
Need a quick break though.
Thumbs up. If you need to step out, go ahead and step out. But time is tight here. Okay, why don't we get rolling? We now are welcoming folks for Disability Advocacy Day. Sarah here?
I believe Sarah is still at the press.
Okay, so essentially, whatever way you guys would like to present, it's entirely up to you. If you would like to have multiple seats up front, you're welcome to. But really, the floor is yours.
If Diane when Diane and Sarah are here, I'm happy to have them join me.
Okay, so we're just waiting for them to arrive.
Yes, I believe
In
so.
person.
I don't know about Diane. I know Sarah is in the building.
Okay,
Would you like me to proceed with my
sure.
remarks?
Be great, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. For the record, my name is Cami Naylor. I'm a staff attorney in the Disability Law Project of Vermont Legal Aid. You received my remarks. I hope that they're posted. I am going to read from my remarks and expand on them in a couple of particular places, but I welcome any committee questions on our perspective. Good morning. Thank you for having us today. My name is Cami Naylor. I'm a staff attorney at Vermont Legal Aid. Legal Aid is the oldest and largest provider of statewide free legal services in Vermont. I work in the Disability Law Project within Vermont Legal Aid, representing individuals with disabilities whose civil legal needs are related to their disability. The majority of my work involves representing students with disabilities in education-related matters. Thank you for the opportunity to address your committee as part of Disability Advocacy Day. The theme of Disability Advocacy Day is write disability rights into every bill. Given all of the work your committee is considering, I think that is particularly important. The Disability Law Project of Vermont Legal Aid is a subgrantee of Disability Rights Vermont. Through our relationship with Disability Rights Vermont, the Disability Law Project advocates for children with disabilities in education matters. Our efforts on behalf of children with disabilities involve both direct representation and systems advocacy. Requests for representation in educational matters represent over half of the requests for legal assistance we receive in the Disability Law Project. In the last 2 years, due to changes in our staffing and increased case needs, we have played a less active role in the legislative process, and we deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. It is our perspective that the importance of addressing systemic challenges in the delivery of education and special education in this moment cannot be overstated. At the federal level, we are witnessing a systemic dismantling of long-held systems responsible for supporting and enforcing the rights of children with disabilities. At the state level, there is a forceful call to transform our educational systems and structures to address ever-increasing costs. Last year, through Act 73, this body commissioned a legislative report on the current state of special education delivery. The report identified a variety of specific concerns and pressures impacting special education service delivery in our state. As your committee considers the ongoing educational transformation work, we ask you to hold and understand that from our perspective, Addressing the pressures on the special education system in Vermont require holding schools accountable, which also means making sure that they have meaningful support to see students with disabilities as students first. In recent years, we've observed significant discussion and concern over the rising costs of special education expenses and extraordinary costs. While I do not have the data available, we encourage you to consider the cost of special education and extraordinary costs, not in isolation, but in comparison to the overall education spending trends, to better understand how these costs are increasing relative to general education expenses. We believe that considering special education costs in a vacuum contributes to a red herring that children with disabilities are driving an education cost problem. While aspects of special education are separate and distinct from general education, the rights of students with disabilities are inseparable. Special education must be considered as part of the whole, not an entity of education unto itself. We laud the work the Agency of Education has done to elevate their special education team within the agency. This is an important step towards ensuring our schools are supported to take meaningful steps to dismantle the general education and special education divide. To give you an illustration of the general education and special education divide, I want to talk about modifying instruction and modifying assignments. Many students have different learning needs, but are included in their general education setting, and that's where they receive their first instruction. Often their IEPs call for modified instruction and modified assignments, but general education teachers don't have the resources or the qualifications in some cases to modify those assignments. And for special education teachers, while they have the qualifications, they're not given the time to meaningfully work with general educators to make sure that the assignment, the instruction is meaningfully modified, the assignments are meaningfully modified, and there's a firm understanding of how to grade those assignments when considering proficiency. We know there is a tremendous amount of incredibly complex work on your plate. As you continue to undertake and lead the educational transformation of Vermont, we echo and raise the concerns of the Act 73 task force and the concerns in the initial report by the Commission on the Future of Public Education. Transforming education systems in Vermont is an incredibly complex problem. You know that. We understand the pressure to put forth a redistricting map, and we know the committee has been working on one. We also understand that the educational foundation formula has not been fully modeled, meaning the committee doesn't know the impact implementation of the foundation formula will have on funding of special education systems that are already overwhelmed. We do not know if the funding formulas and their associated weights will meet the federal requirements for maintenance of effort and maintenance of state support. If these metrics are not met, we risk federal IDEA funds, which, as you may know, have never been fully funded at the federal level. So we're already getting less than we need from the feds. We urge you to work with JFO, and I know JFO was just speaking with you, to model the foundation funding formula and understand how even on a statewide level, funding for special education will be impacted. We understand that in some regions, it is too hard to pull the specific special education data, but the Agency of Education has the data for all students in Vermont, and they should be able to deliver that so that you can look at the weights more meaningfully. Our direct advocacy work reflects many of the findings of the Special Education Delivery Report. While I acknowledge and hold tension that the families seeking my assistance represent those struggling the most significantly with our education systems, we believe our experiences accurately reflect the systemic challenges. In short, our supervisory unions, schools, and school districts lack capacity, and our students with disabilities pay the costs. In our work, this looks like inadequate staff to provide services. What that means is oftentimes students have a service or a support written into their IEP. For example, last year, there were a number of districts that sent out no service letters to students with disabilities and their families. The no service that they could offer, at least in one supervisory union, was a student's behavior interventionist. So that one-on-one that worked with a student in supporting their behavior throughout the day. And that means that the student doesn't have access to the service they're entitled to. That's a denial of their right to a free and appropriate public education. We also see service decisions being driven by available resources, not individual analysis. And we get it. This is an impossible bind for schools. But what it means is that children may not be being served in their least restrictive environments and are almost certainly being denied FAPE. So for a student who is having really difficult sensory experiences at school, they may benefit from direct OT services or consult OT services. Direct OT services would be a student, working with an OT. Consult OT services look like their OT doing some observation of that student and interacting with the team members, other team members and other teachers to help those teachers understand when to intervene, when to offer the student support, and how to best support their sensory needs in the classroom environment. Many kiddos show up at school needing direct OT support, and their districts, because of available resources, are only able to offer consult OT supports. Oftentimes, this looks like schools saying, we don't provide direct services in that related service area. That's not an individualized decision. We see significant over-reliance on paraeducators to support our most complex learners. In our opinion, this often results in a denial of FAPE and the failure to provide services in the least restrictive environment. And in some cases, it creates extremely complex problems for future educators and IEP teams to solve. So when a paraeducator is working with a complex and challenging student or working as a behavior interventionist, and that child has a behavior plan, and that child is having challenging behaviors, remember that our paraeducators are often the least trained staff in the building. And so they know that their job is to help support that student in their behavior. And they know that their job is to try to help make sure that that student can be in a classroom. And sometimes what that looks like is out of desperation or goodwill, or for a million legitimate reasons, that least trained person in the building does what they think and they understand that behavior support plan to say, but what they're really doing is co-regulating, right? Their presence, their intervention, their coaching is calming that child's nervous system and helping them stay where they are. But co-regulating doesn't teach behaviors or change the environment so that that child is learning new ways to interact in a challenging environment. So then what we see is when that child has a major educational transition, for example, the transition from elementary school to middle school, and they no longer have a BI because they were doing a great job, they blow out. And when I say they blow out, I don't mean like it's hard to go to school. I mean, there are really severe behaviors. They are in danger. Other people are sometimes in danger. And in the handful of cases that I have seen that has followed this narrative, those kiddos end up without a placement. We also see ongoing soft exclusion of vulnerable students with disabilities in violation of their due process rights, their right to FAPE, and their right to an LRE. What is a soft exclusion? That's often when the school calls mom or dad and says, hey, Johnny's having a really hard time today. This is what's going on. So the school isn't saying you need to come get him. The school isn't saying he's suspended, but the school is throwing it out there and encouraging the parents that bringing him home might help him feel better. Did you have a question, Chair?
No.
Okay. We also see an inadequate continuum of least restrictive environments, leading to an over-reliance on alternative placements that have significant wait lists, resulting in students with disabilities receiving interim, inadequate services and lacking access to their free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. We do not believe Lifting the moratorium on the approval of independent schools eligible to receive public funds will solve this problem, although it may help. As a disability advocates, we're extremely concerned about the limited oversight of independent schools and the privatization of services for our most vulnerable learners. We do believe greater use of boards of cooperative education services, as described in Act 168 of 2024, contained beginning at 16 VSA 601, like the recently approved Southeast Regional BOCES, must be supported and play a primary role in addressing the inadequacies of the educational continuum. Statewide, legislatively led efforts to contain educational costs and transform educational systems in the last decade have been met with resistance and poor implementation. In fact, it's my understanding that census-based funding approach to special education developed in 2018 has yet to be fully implemented, and we're already talking about changing the funding formulas. We understand the urgency behind needing to address educational quality and costs in Vermont. We agree, we ask the committee to consider that rushed solutions to complex problems often result in more failure, resistance, and poor implementation, which will further compromise our educational systems. Vermont's children are our future. We must understand all of the implications of changing educational governance, delivery, and funding will have on the systems, ensure schools are meaningfully supportive, and move forward with caution and purpose. Our children deserve systemic transformation that will support their success, not annihilate the system they're trying to interact with. On February 28th, I attended a virtual listening session with OSERS, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. As I listened to other callers imploring the federal government to continue to fund, support, and enforce special education and rehabilitative services, I heard many adults with disabilities share their experiences and life successes resulting from receiving services they needed as a child. The repeated message was, these systems are valuable because of the return on investment. That was both an effective and troubling message to hear. At Vermont Legal Aid, we believe all children have value and deserve quality education, regardless of their future contribution. In a moment where so many rights are threatened, I'd like to leave you with the 16 VSA Section 1, which is the current state statement on the policy of education in Vermont. The right to public education is integral to Vermont's constitutional form of government, its guarantees of political and civil rights. Further, the right to education is fundamental for the success of Vermont's children in a rapidly changing society and global marketplace, as well as for the state's own economic and social prosperity. To keep Vermont's democracy competitive and thriving, Vermont students must be afforded substantially equal access to quality basic education. However, one of the strengths of Vermont's education system lies in its rich diversity and the ability of each local school district to adapt its educational programs to local needs and desires. Therefore, it is the policy of the state of Vermont that all children will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal through the educational programs, although the educational programs may vary from district to district. We thank the committee for your work and investment in all of Vermont's children, and especially Vermont's children with disabilities. I don't see any of the other folks listed on the agenda. There have been 2 other committees.
I'm sure you'll provide a great resource for any questions we have.
Yes, I'm happy to ask any questions or answer any questions the committee may have. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
So this is the question I ask kind of every year that these issues come up, and we talk about, inadequate staff to provide services, service decisions being driven by available resources, all over reliance on para-educators. Doesn't that all, it really kind of boils down to, we just don't have the people with the skills to meet the needs in many cases of the students with disabilities?
I think it's a yes and answer for me. I think, yes, it's true. We don't have enough bodies to do the work. I also think that what I commonly see is really, really well-intentioned schools that don't have the level of technical assistance and coaching that they need to be agile in making decisions about student services and needs. A couple years ago, I represented a young man who was removed from school. He'd had some pretty serious behaviors, and the school felt like a therapeutic program would be appropriate for him. Mom and dad disagreed. The steps were being taken to secure a therapeutic program, but there wasn't one available. And so I entered the picture and worked collaboratively with the school's administration, and we were able to establish a highly individualized educational placement for him in his local school with the supports that he needed. That once that was in place, he was increasing his access to his peers and his access to school substantially. And so we went from having this kiddo who the team was in crisis and didn't know how to support him and was really concerned about his safety and everyone else's, to a situation where he was having a greater level of access to school than he was even before he was removed. And I had an opportunity to recently see the superintendent who was involved in some of the decision-making around putting that program into place for him. And I said to her, we did it. So you and I did it. Like, why is it so hard? And she said, it's so hard because the system is so flooded. Schools are so flooded that we don't have time to meaningfully think about how we're making these decisions. And so I think for me, part of the limitations of the system right now also goes back to, what does the general supervision of the entire system look like? And it's the agency of education that's responsible for that general supervision. And I think we also saw this play out with the implementation of the MTSS systems. And incredible materials were developed and distributed. But what schools needed was connection and more technical assistance and actual instruction in schools demonstrating how to do it and sort of alleviating some of the pressures on those individual schools by bringing in intentional supports. And so I think that, yes, we may not have enough bodies, but I also think that the system needs better supports for schools. I think sometimes we forget that, like, right, schools are the boots on the ground, but the boots on the ground don't work if the entire system isn't designed to make sure that they can do their job.
Anybody else?
I might just add that the work is incredibly hard. And I think we have special educators leaving. And so it's not so much that that the bodies aren't available. The bodies no longer want to do that work because it's hard.
And they feel disenfranchised, right? The decision-making that occurs in an IEP context is often administrators making decisions. In full transparency, my spouse is a principal at an elementary school in Vermont. So we have some really interesting dinner time conversations. And he started his career in public education as a behavior interventionist. And he moved to being a special educator and very quickly realized how disenfranchised he was in that process. And while he could make meaningful change on a day-to-day basis for a child, he didn't have the resources he needed to implement the services for that child to make meaningful, intentional change at a broader level. And that frustration, that inability, being the person who works directly with a child to say, no, this is what they need. Which, of course, special educators are members of IEP teams, but again, decisions are often being driven by resources. We led him to administration so that he had more power to make those decisions, to set up systems that he believed would be more supportive of students. It's incredibly hard work. I remind many parents of that on a very regular basis, right? Like I recognize there's an incredible tension in some of the phone calls that I have and the work that I do. And I am a big fan of reminding folks who are experiencing crisis and are having really, truly challenging things happen and are having their child's rights violated, that we're not going to make progress on solving this problem if we can't take the temperature down. And part of taking the temperature down, remembering that no one gets into public education to hurt kids, but that sometimes harm happens.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for your
Enlighten us even
time.
further.
Paul.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
All right, so a reminder, committee, we are downstairs at 1:15 for continued joint.
Is that 10 or 11?
You're on.